brief kind of high-level remarks of things to look out for. So one thing to look out for is that it is very hard to find two people on the face of the earth who will define net neutrality the same way. And definitions are important to us as lawyers, so look out for the definitional issue. One of the more interesting issues that's coming and hasn't yet landed is privacy of data and how it might or might not fit into net neutrality. Traditionally, net neutrality hasn't really been about privacy of data, but we know privacy of data is a very big deal and becoming a bigger and bigger deal the way Google and Facebook are able to monetize it, and should net neutrality encompass that or not, is an interesting issue, and we may get into it a little bit today, don't expect too much. Another real anomaly about net neutrality is that it's one of the few issues that defies, to a pretty large degree, simple political definition. You can argue net neutrality on either side, either from a free market perspective or an equal access perspective. And the right and left are often interchangeable when it comes to this discussion. So those are just some things to look out for, and without further ado, let's start with Ian Bell, who's going to show us some slides.
What I did on my Silicon Valley vacation slides. So, you know, I'm pretty old. I was sitting at university in 1990 when the internet was dropped in my lap, and you know, it became, for my generation, an enormous opportunity, and we jumped on that and massively seized that opportunity. And one of the core principles that created that for us was the openness of the network, the fact that anyone could connect to anyone else over the internet. The internet, just to put some context, I'm not just being cheeky when I use the term stupid network. The internet was designed as a stupid network. It was designed with intelligent endpoints, and all of the routers and switches and all of the devices that move traffic in bits and bytes between two different points on the internet were designed to be stupid. The reason was because they had to handle a high capacity of traffic at a time when computing power was actually reasonably meager. And so routers, which is what your telecom company has lots of in machine rooms all over the world, routers were pretty stupid, and in general they still are today. But what's changing is that with lots of technological improvements, computing power improvements, all of those things, they're starting to be able to manipulate the data that flows across their network in interesting ways, ways which benefit us in some ways, but also ways that can obviously be used to put their businesses at an advantage. So I'll kind of explain some of that as we roll. So what's the internet? Most people think of the internet as this cloud. You know, you get your phone, you get your computer, you connect to somewhere, and you're connecting to this network called the internet. Well, the internet isn't really a network. It's a network of networks. It's massively complex. And so, I mean, this is a hub and spoke network that represents the internet. You can see that most of the points on this map, except for the endpoints, are connected in multiple ways to each other. And so that defines how the internet was originally conceived. And this is obviously really complex, but guess what? This is 1999. Here's what that looks like today. It's unmappable today. It is so large. This is actually from 2015, and it's based on an estimate. So the founding principles of the internet, and this is really good reading if you're interested in the topic. A guy named David Eisenberg, who worked at Bell Labs, wrote this paper called Rise of the Stupid Network, and that's where the term stupid network really sort of came to the fore. And again, he espoused these principles of design, which are all about building a network that is over-provisioned. In other words, there's more capacity in the core of the network and on the different connections of the network than exists at the edge of the network. And that is how the peering points on the network were expected to communicate to one another. One of the principles embodied in that is kind of the value of it. If I'm TELUS and you're Rogers, we have an implicit promise that you won't mess with the traffic that I send in your direction, and I won't mess with the traffic you send in my direction. And that is actually unspoken principle that governed how all of these communications companies and all these users connected to each other for decades. Tim Wu talked about broadband discrimination. He brought to the fore the idea of extending, in the US anyway, the notion of a common carrier. We'll probably hear this term a few times today. What a common carrier is basically a telecommunications company that offers a general service that anyone can access, and they're expected to do that in a non-discriminatory manner. And the word non-discriminatory comes up a lot when you talk about net neutrality. The White House authored an interesting document in 1997, their framework for global commerce. By global commerce, they kind of expanded to cover telecommunications as the internet came to embody that. If you think about the idea of making a call over the internet, 1997 was kind of the first time where that idea started to become mainstream. It wasn't really until Skype came along in 2002 that really started to expand. And then there's an Fcc Declaratory Ruling. I mention it because I actually worked on the team that presented this brief to the Fcc in 2004. By then I had co-founded with some friends a company called Ringcentral. Ringcentral offers voice services over your internet connection. So we're a phone company with no phone lines. Phone company with 0 phone circuits. We have 0 phone routing technology. Even the incoming calls that arrive at Ringcentral from a phone number in Peoria, Illinois, they arrive on a voice over IP network owned by another company, and we just lease on a permanent basis access to the network. Because Ringcentral is largely unregulated, it allowed us to grow, and because of this expectation of common carrier status on behalf of the people that do sell the physical circuits to folks at their office or at their home, we were able to fight to prevent companies, and this did happen, from blocking Ringcentral calls arriving through their network. So here's how the telecom companies get you. The first thing they can do is they can discriminate on their traffic on a protocol basis. So most traffic that flows over the internet is assigned to a given port, and each port is assigned to a given protocol. And if you're running a sophisticated enough router, which most of these guys are, you can now monitor those ports. You can set different traffic thresholds for those ports and use that to limit the amount of bandwidth that can be pushed through that port. You can also block that port wholesale if you want to just stop all traffic that flows over that port. So, for example, now I'm trying to remember the port. So Ringcentral uses the SIP protocol. The SIP protocol runs on port 5062. If somebody wanted to block Ringcentral, all they have to do is block 5062. Discrimination by source and destination IP address. Pretty obvious. If I want to stop you from accessing a website or some other service on the internet, all I have to do is block access to that IP address on my network. And the same for the inverse. If I want to keep people from being able to connect to you, I can do the same thing. Exemption via private networks. This is a little more complicated. So I can create private networks that run through my network as kind of a virtualized private network. And I can use that to advantage or disadvantage different services. So I can flow all of the traffic for a given port range or a set of protocols through a specific private network. Maybe that private network has priority over the rest of the traffic flowing across that network. I can use that to do stuff like, free, all you can download music on your mobile phone that doesn't hit your download cap, which is one way they can advantage you. But maybe that also disadvantages folks like Spotify who don't have access to that same capability because they're not a carrier. Favored peering. This is happening a lot. So Netflix has been essentially held for ransom by a bunch of carriers in the United States and in Canada, where they've experienced, their customers have experienced obviously poor download speeds for movies they're trying to watch. This may or may not be because of item number one. or it might just be because of sheer volume and too much distance from Amazon servers to the end user. But they can get around that by establishing VPN connections or putting physical hardware in the facilities of the telecom carrier at great expense, mind you, and use that to get better performance for their services. So that's great for Netflix when you're, I don't know what the valuation of Netflix is, but let's say $10 billion company. It's great when you're Netflix. It's hard when you're just starting out and you're offering your fledgling movie streaming service on a $10 million financing from a VC. So what's the problem with all of this stuff? Traffic shaping has worked at an internet scale since 2005. So internet service providers have been able to manipulate the performance of different elements of what's going across the network for about 13 years. And they can use that for good, they can use that for bad. They can use that to make things like voice over IP, which is very sensitive to bandwidth and latency. They can use that to make it better. They can also use it to disadvantage folks like Ringcentral and Bondage and Skype and whoever else. Deep packet inspection, this is happening now. This is part of the reason why this debate is a really important one to have today. So now they can look at the actual content of the data at scale that's flowing across their network. It's very computationally intensive to do that because they have to reassemble lots of different packets on the way through, but they can use that to actually look at the nature of what you're doing on the internet, which is potentially a source of a lot of abuse, and it's exactly what you were just talking about. Detection. So if I am an end user and I think this might be happening, the level of sophistication, I'm a guy who's architected huge networks in my career. I would have to go and spend about $10,000 on equipment to actually figure this out. It would take me weeks to actually come up with some demonstrable proof that this is actually happening to me. And at the end of the day, the only way we can totally confirm that this is happening is if the carrier voluntarily discloses that it's happening. The other thing that occurs to me as I was writing this was the idea of combining some of these capabilities with other things like the DMCA could be quite powerful and quite anti-consumer. So imagine that Warner Music decides you're a pirate, you're not supposed to be sharing your music with your friends on your local connection. So I'm just going to call your carrier and I'm going to order your carrier to throttle all of your music traffic. And you're no longer able to do whatever that is. There was no trial. There was no opportunity for you to defend yourself against that accusation. It just happened. You might not even be aware that it happened or why or how. And you spend all your time in Future Shop trying to get somebody to fix your computer. So there's a few differences between Canada and the US. In Canada, the Telecommunications Act of 1991 is applied to the internet essentially since the internet's inception as a consumer phenomenon here. So the CRTC has been administering this for quite a while. There's been a few enforcement actions. One of my favorite is when TELUS was blocking access to their union's website across the entire TELUS network. So obvious. So obviously, but that wasn't actually even administered by the CRTC. That became a free speech issue. But ultimately, a détente was reached, mostly through negotiations, not through the courts, actually. In 2009, there was a net neutrality decision based on a presumption that Bell Media was actually doing some predatory traffic or discriminatory traffic shaping. Turned out they weren't. They were later, but we'll get to that. But at least it established sort of clear guidelines for what we expect in net neutrality in Canada. And in general, I'd say that there's been a focus on enforcing policy, but not really defining that in law. You find that a lot in Canadian regulation. It applies to a lot of the tax code. It applies to lots of things in this country. In the USA, obviously the Clinton government started with this hands-off policy. Let's not touch it. Let's focus on conflict resolution rather than policy enforcement. The Pulver Order in 2004 essentially set aside voice over IP as an unregulated entity, which exempted a lot of the VoIP companies from some requirements, including 911 and things like that. The Open Internet Order came along under Obama in 2010, and of course, like everything else Obama did, it has to be reversed within 2 years, and so the FCC essentially had this policy that they couldn't enforce. And so now we arrive at the repealing of net neutrality in recent months under the Orange Cheeto. My modest proposal. So I live on both sides I have lived on both sides of this debate. I worked at the carrier a long, long time ago as the internet was just starting, and I co-founded a company that completely benefits from net neutrality. Voice over IP and video over IP, conversations between people in real time are particularly sensitive to latency and availability of bandwidth over the internet. More so than video streaming or something, or text chat or anything like that. Ringcentral would not be possible if not for the characteristics of the network that were set forth in the 90s. In Canada, we kind of already have this environment where the CRTC is set up to administer this. Again, they kind of focus on conflict resolution rather than setting forth specific policy. There's no law that enshrines our rights as end users on the internet. I would posit that we need one, and the technology has matured sufficiently that we could actually establish that. There have been some private members' bills that have been foisted. They haven't gone very far. But at the core of our Internet Bill of Rights in Canada would be principles underlying net neutrality. We can talk a bit about those as we go. But the one caveat is that one thing we like to do in Canada is protect our culture. So we have Canadian content rules. The shows that are available on Netflix in Canada are quite a bit different from the shows that are available on Netflix in the US. That applies to any content-based network. And so that's going to be a real big challenge for us to surmount because those are competing ideologies. Then we get into the technical stuff. So you probably haven't seen this before, but this is how the internet works. It works on I call it the 7-layer DIP, but this is actually called the OSI model. And if you look at the very bottom, you see physical links, and then there's some abstraction over top of that. And then increasingly user-centric levels of abstraction on top of that. I propose that we force telecom companies to play only in the blue box. You don't get to do any traffic shaping, you don't get to do any content analysis, any routing, or anything above those bottom 4 layers. So that means you don't touch Skype, you don't touch any web application, you don't touch anything unless it lives within those 4 blocks. Because that's, frankly, telecom companies are guys with trucks who dig holes and lay cable and make sure it's always on and monitor the yellow lights. That's what a telecom company is. It's what it probably should be. And all this other ambition is bullshit. So 2 stories. When my first week at BC Tel was late, I think it was 97. And they were just preparing to roll out ADSL, high-speed internet, to all the residential communities in British Columbia. And they had spent $23 million paying Cisco to, have you ever stayed at a hotel where the hotel makes you log in with your room number and your name before you can access the internet? They wanted to do that to the whole province. And they spent all this money paying Cisco to create this walled garden that would force people to log in using their BC Tel user ID, and then force you through a web portal that had all this high-speed content. They also spent tens of millions of dollars building. And my first week at BC Tel, I made a lot of enemies because I killed the project. And it occurred to no one on the management team of this company that the real reason people want broadband internet connections is not because they're fast, it's because they're always on. It's because I can open up my computer and I'm connected. Or I can have my camera, my IP camera, monitoring my house or my doorbell or whatever else we have today, always on. None of those things would work if each of them had to log in with my user ID every time they wanted to connect to the internet. And so yeah, made a lot of enemies, killed the project. Ultimately, we launched the DSL you have today, and BC Tel saved a lot of money in the long term. Ringcentral, company we founded actually as a different company in 1999, but as happened in Silicon Valley, roller coaster ride. In 2001, we rolled out Ringcentral. Totally dependent on being an over-the-top service. So like I said, we don't no phone lines, no circuits, barely any machines in racks. You know, we were really a Silicon Valley cloud-based company, totally dependent on you bringing your own internet connection and using voice over IP enabled phones, such as you can buy for $100 today or $40. If you think about it, in those days, if you wanted a business phone line, it was $170 per line to your office. And a lot of times you would have a PBX, which probably, looking at the age of the people here, probably don't even know what a PBX is.
I know what a PBX is.
PBX is basically a shitty computer that sits in your office and plugs into your phone lines and routes the calls to all the phones inside the office in an analog fashion. Those were expensive. Around 2000, everybody had to replace them because they only had two-digit year codes. So by 2005, when Ringcentral was kind of hitting its stride, they were looking to replace those machines, and we got rid of that idea. You could just have Ethernet or Wi-Fi within your office, and whatever your regular internet connection was, and all your phone calls essentially worked the same, and your PBX lived in the cloud. You never had to touch it, you never had to reboot it, you never had to clean the dust off of it. It was our fault. And that idea of, well, and by the way, Ringcentral was still is around $25 a circuit, so that's how much of an advantage we had by taking all the bottom layers away from the gate. We didn't have to pay for circuits or any of that other stuff, and we could offer that at considerably greater profit margin than what a telecom carrier could. Now it's a $5 billion company. My partners have all got Teslas and more. That's it.
Awesome. All right. We'll get Tom's slides up. He will get equal time. And we will take the rest of the time in questions from all of you. So think of your questions.
How did my wife get it? I don't know. Yeah, you can close that.
Yeah, it's not even on this.
When did you two meet?
There we go.
That was weird.
Yeah,
Anyway, yeah, I'm Tom. I'm an attorney in the U.S., so most of my background and knowledge is about U.S. telecom law, although I have tried to brush up a bit on Canadian telecom law. I'll try to touch on that where possible. But I've tried to make this presentation high level and general as possible, so it will be applicable to you all. And I'll, I guess, preface this by saying I agreed with most all of Ian's presentation, so if you're expecting a rancorous, heated debate, it's probably not going to happen, but as law students, I'm sure you all can appreciate the subtleties and nuances of a legal debate, so there will be areas of disagreement that I'll point out along the way, but anyway, let's get into it. Neutrality, or internet freedom, as we often also call the U.S. I don't think there's much difference between the two. There's both some high-level catchphrases that don't mean much, but we're talking about broadband regulation. How do you regulate ISPs? So let's get into it.
Look at sabotage and
I gotta take a photo of that for my wife. I need a lawyer.
So, anyway, here's the resolution. You all heard it earlier, but the repeal of net neutrality poses serious threats to innovation and consumer access in the U.S., and you all should pay heed. I don't think those threats are that serious. I think you guys should be paying attention, but I don't think the sky is about to fall imminently, and I actually think things could get better going forward, but we all should be paying attention anyway. So, as John mentioned in the preface to all of this, net neutrality is not a specifically defined phrase. It has been defined in multiple different ways. Here are 3 examples. Tim Wu, the godfather of net neutrality, sort of coined the phrase, although the movement stretches back decades into the late 20th century and early telecom law. But in his first article, Neutrality, Broadband Discrimination, which is also cited in Ian's presentation, he referred to it as a shorthand for a system of belief about innovation policy. And then he got a bit more specific about what that meant. Actually talks a lot about video games in that as sort of the examples of non-neutral internet behavior that might require, I guess, yeah, prioritization on the part of ISPs. But we'll get back to that. I guess, dictionary definition. Merriam-Webster has given one. It's in the unabridged online version, but you can read it there. And that's pretty much taking the phrase net neutrality literally, saying that all data should be treated the same, regardless of its kind, source, or destination. I think that is sort of what the phrase net neutrality would literally imply. I don't really ascribe to that definition. I mean, even my friends, progressive, very avid supporters of net neutrality don't ascribe to that.
This is going on a technological level, and the threats are looming in terms of the ease with which carriers can use this technological capability to interfere. And history has shown, and I only gave you a couple of examples, but history has shown that they will. I have no delusions that if they thought they could get away with it, Verizon would deprioritize packet traffic from Ringcentral service to protect their business phone service. And if you think you don't have a dog in the fight in the US, remember that most of the services you access today in Canada are actually hosted in the United States, even if they're from Canadian companies. If you do a trace route from a command line of any computer and you can find a specific server somewhere in Toronto or Halifax, odds are about 9 in 10 that the traffic between you and Toronto actually routes via Ohio and Chicago and Buffalo. So we don't really have an internet in Canada that is distinct from the United States. So what they're doing has a lot of effect on us. And again, carriers can often bias traffic for consumers versus their business customers, but generally they apply the same policies across the entire network because it's easier. In effect, I think we need to police our traffic, and again, I stand back on the idea of a Bill of Rights, which certainly benefits you as individual consumers, but would also benefit companies like Ringcentral or whatever is better than Ringcentral that is being developed somewhere in Canada.
Sean, do you have any particular thing you want to say?
Oh, yeah, I guess,
we're rebutting rebuttals now, so I wanted to be real quick.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any rebuttal to Ian's rebuttal, but I guess one thing I meant to mention in my talk, but Ian's idea about, I think the title of the presentation, about keeping the network down, which is traditionally how it's worked. It's all just sort of best efforts, internet traffic management, and sort of intelligence in the network is just packets in, packets out as fast as you can, hope it all works, and by and large it has. I think oftentimes I hear sort of that idea about dumb networks, smart ends, described as the end-to-end principle, which I think is a very similar concept to net neutrality from the application developer side. The whole benefit of the sort of end-to-end principle is that you can develop an application or a service at any point in the network, and you know that it'll work throughout the whole network because that's just how it works. The internet protocols are basic, and you just design your application around them and trust that it'll work. I think we could keep to the end-to-end principle and allow that freedom and certainty for app developers while still injecting more intelligence into the network through software-defined networking. In particular, maybe apply machine learning to software-defined networks in terms of traffic shaping. I think we could have a smart network that does engage in more differential traffic management while still respecting the end-to-end principle. But that's, I guess,
Yeah.
That's awesome. Great. So, are there any questions? I have some ideas of where we could go here, but are there any questions that anyone wants to ask of our combatants? All right. I'd like to do something with your permission if there are no questions. But I'm going to need Ian to log in. But I want to know if anybody objects. Have you both seen the Burger King net neutrality commercial?
No.
You have?
Yeah.
Are you okay if we show it to the group?
Sure.
Okay. And so this will be a little bit of a treat, and hopefully,
So I think I like these wheels.
they're really cool. I got it in green. Your entire system is like persistent. So if you can
We're
just
not online, right?
we're not online.
Yeah. Well, we'll use some of my precious mobile bandwidth.
You sure you're okay with that?
Yeah, yeah.
Because I can get online.
Thousands of dollars I will now spend.
Well, with a fun, and by the way,
Here we go.
the Netflix market cap is $141 billion. And
A long time ago, that guy wanted me to be his roommate. I wish I'd done
all right. And let's hope we have sound.
it.
We don't? Can you hear?
With net neutrality, some people, for what it's worth, just,
I don't know exactly what it is.
Got number one. Hey, how you doing? Number 98. You got the Whopper? Yeah. So you got the slow access Whopper pass? It's on the menu right there with the fast, medium, slow. There's slow MBPS, fast MBPS, or hyper fast MBPS. MBPS, of course, standing for making burgers per second.
So if we want a Whopper now, we have to pay $26.
Well, that's how you get it fast. That's the highest priority. This is like a lane, so it'll be like 15, fast lane, slow lane. So like maybe like 15, 20 minutes.
What are you talking about?
Commercial ways that they can sell more and make more money. Whopper.
Were you given an option of chicken sandwich or?
Yeah, I don't want a chicken sandwich. I really want a Whopper.
Do you have any Whoppers ready that aren't?
Yeah.
The sandwich is ready, I'm just not allowed to actually get it to
Why?
you.
You can't give me the sandwich. It's ready, but you can't give it to me. Whopper neutrality was repealed. They voted on it. Whopper what? Oh, God, this is the worst thing I've ever heard of. It's like you gotta be fast.
Are you kidding me? You paid $26 for a Whopper?
Yeah, you ordered it. Now it's a higher priority, so.
If
Guys, I love burger, man.
If you'd like,
This is a bad dream right now. I just want burger, brother. Burger.
I look at all these things. It's crazy.
here's what I'll do. You have the bag. Put it in the bag in 42 seconds.
Hold on. 10 seconds. You don't make the rules. You just enforce these ridiculous rules.
We have to.
I feel like I was being taken advantage of in a sense. Just as a customer coming in to get their food, it's felt like a power move.
They already changed the policies overnight or whatever.
I didn't think that ordering a Whopper would really open my eyes up to net neutrality. The Whopper actually told me about net neutrality. It's stupid, but true.
Right, enjoyed that.
Yeah, there's the
You write rules when you know what you want to do in some specific practice. You can draw a clean box around it and say, all right, here's the thing. We know it's a thing, it's bad, so here's a rule. Use standards in different cases. This is Supreme Court opinion, Chenery, which of course is not precedent here in Canada, but I think it sort of illustrates the general debate between rules versus standards and when you should go with standards over rules. Justice, I forget who wrote this, but basically he identified 3 different occasions where a standard, a general standard, more flexible is better than a rigid rule. Either when an agency, could not reasonably foresee problems, then a specific rule is not going to do you any good, but a broad standard could stretch to cover that. Or if you don't have sufficient experience with a particular problem to warrant refining a rule, then standards are better. Or if the problem is just so specialized and varying in nature that it's impossible to draw the boundaries around it. Those are 3 reasons. I would say that at least the second and third apply pretty well to the internet. Now, of course, the internet's been around for going on 20 years, at least the modern commercial internet, and it's totally reasonable that at the early stage of the internet, everyone would agree that we don't know what we're doing, so we're not going to write a bunch of rules to govern this new thing. We're just going to let it evolve on its own and hope for the best, keep a watchful eye on it. Now, with 20 years of experience, we have a better understanding of what the internet is and isn't, and we could, adopt some more specific rules and not rely just on broad standards anymore. But there's still certain areas that I think there is substantial disagreement on. I guess I would admit that blocking, I think, is a perfectly reasonable rule. I think you can codify that with pretty specific language in a way that would not be unduly burdensome, but would offer substantial protections for consumers. So I'm totally on board with a blocking rule, and particularly I love the transparency rule as well. But paid prioritization, or just prioritization, I think we should have a standard for that. Specifically, I guess, transparency plus flexible standards, in my opinion, should regulate prioritization or differential traffic management by ISPs. Not everyone agrees, of course, but I would point to you, this was a fun footnote. A bunch of internet engineers, I double-checked, Ian was not on the list, although he could have been. There was about 50 engineers, including Tim Berners-Lee, Vint Cerf, a lot of heavy hitters, internet pioneers. But they filed this comment with the FCC last summer, opposing their proposed rollback of the 2015 rules. And this was on page 37, 77th footnote. And here, they're addressing the diff-serve protocols. Obviously, Ian is much more ensconced in computer science than I am. He actually develops applications and has much more knowledge of these particular things. But basically, the internet protocols, IPv4 and IPv6, included in the packet headers, the headers of packets, a QoS field, or diff-serve code point, which is the technical way that ISPs would prioritize or deprioritize traffic. You would classify things, this is really sensitive, latency sensitive, packet loss sensitive, whatever. This really needs to get through, otherwise consumers, the quality of experience is going to go way down. VoIP is the classic example that people point to. And of course, E911, emergency services, there's a lot of things that everyone would agree should get priority on the network. But when it gets into the commercial prioritization, there's a lot more disagreement. And at least, as these engineers point out, the diff-serve protocol field has not been used much. I believe they say, traffic prioritization on the public internet is almost non-existent. That's, of course, the public internet. There are private lines as well. That's another way to prioritize traffic and increase user experience. But broadly speaking, there is no consensus about how to use the diff-serve code point in terms of packet management and differential traffic. But it still exists. It is a useful tool, and I would like to see some more experimentation with that in terms of traffic shaping and other things on just as part of general internet service that make it work better. Obviously, VoIP has gotten a lot better. And Jon's, talking video games professor. I play a lot of video games myself still, because I'm still in my 20s. And I run into lag and other things that upset my user experience when I'm playing FIFA or Call of Duty or whatever. So there's things on the internet that could work better with more management on the ISP side, but that also comes with a lot of potential problems. Those same tools can be used for good or evil, and if there's no oversight, then I wouldn't really trust ISPs to always use them for good, because they're rational, profit-seeking corporations. It's the nature of the beast. But anyway, that is, I guess, the one part of the 2017 Restoring the Freedom Order, the repeal of 2015 rules that I think is good. Particularly, I guess as that last slide showed, pairing a general standard saying you can't engage in any competitive behavior, so like you can't prioritize your own services over competitor services, because that would be anti-competitive. That's just general antitrust. But of course, as the FTC definition said earlier, net neutrality implies something beyond just general antitrust. It implies consumer protection online, even where there isn't a market power issue. If there's just something unfair or deceptive that ISPs engage in, that's also illegal under the general FTC standards. But particularly pairing those standards with a specific transparency rule, which require transparent disclosures both downstream and upstream. As an ISP has to tell its customers what it's doing, and if it prioritizes certain applications over others, it has to disclose that as part of its terms of service. I would say more importantly is that it has to disclose that upstream to application developers like Ian or others and say, hey, I want to start prioritizing VoIP. If you are offering some, VoIP, make sure you mark your packets like this, so I know it's VoIP and I can treat it accordingly. Or say you want to roll out some prioritized gaming service or some virtual reality, multi-user, social media environment. There's a lot of different things that could be done, but I guess I want to encourage experimentation with those protocols because I can imagine different things that could make them useful, but we need transparency and oversight if ISPs are to engage in any of that experimentation. So that's what we have now, and I think particularly under the FTC's deception standard, you don't even have to show consumer harm to bring a complaint against an ISP. It's under their deception authority. It's enough to show that they deceived you. It's illegal to lie to customers. And so in terms of a nimble enforcement process, pairing transparency with the FTC's deception standard could allow for very quick resolution of consumer complaints or other disputes in the ISP context. But that's what we're left with now. Going forward, the relitigation, of course, as I already mentioned, it's already underway. We're writing briefs this summer and probably arguing next fall. I'll be writing a brief, I'll be arguing next summer. There have been several state laws and executive orders in the US since the December order trying to reinstate net neutrality at the state and local level. Some of those, I think, could survive review, particularly the executive orders that just say if you're providing internet to the government, you have to offer it on a neutral basis. You can't engage in paid privatization, throttling, or blocking. Where the government is just acting as a consumer, if they want to, buy a certain level of internet service and ISP is willing to give that, fine. There's no real legal complaint. But there's also several state laws. I think Washington is the first one to pass theirs, I think earlier this week. Basically just imposing net neutrality regulations throughout the state. Also some of the EOs require, if you do contract with the government in any respect, you're bound by these obligations, not just when you're serving the government, but serving any consumer in this state. I think those do bump up against the Interstate Commerce Clause in the US Constitution, and I do not generally think state-level internet regulations are a good idea, whether it comes to privacy or telecom or whatever. The internet does not really respect state boundaries and even nation boundaries at times. So I think these need to be regulated at the federal level and get a uniform standard across the board, maybe even at the international level. I'm not a big fan of the ITU, the UN's International Telecommunication Union, but they used to do a lot of telecom regulation back in the day with international calling fees and standards for maximum latency in a voice call, because after like 200 milliseconds, the voice quality goes way down. So it's possible we could even get some sort of international net neutrality regs from the ITU, although I don't think we're quite ready for that yet. I think we are still experimenting at the state level, or at the federal level, and between different countries. Now, of course, law, is not a lab science. We don't have a lot of experiments out there, but we do now sort of have a natural experiment between Canada and the US. With Canada still has very strong net neutrality rules, a per se ban on zero rating, as I understand it. The US has a much more flexible approach already to zero rating, and we're returning to a very flexible approach to net neutrality more broadly. So going forward, I think we'll be watching closely between the US and Canada to see sort of what results we have. Ian and net neutrality supporters who opposed the December ruling at the FCC will probably expect that startups or VC capital will flow, increasingly to Canada and away from the US because Canada has more, favorable consumer protections in place for those sorts of startups. And broadband, obviously, hope can get lower costs, also, innovation, all the good things. and it will leave the US. I don't know if that will happen. It's pretty difficult to measure, but you could see the alternative happening. With a less restrictive, more free-wheeling environment, you could see more investment and innovation come out of the US after this. I think it remains to be seen, and people have different opinions about how it will pan out, but that's what I guess we'll be watching for in the next couple of years, assuming the order is upheld, which I think it probably will be, but I won't speculate yet on that. Yeah, I guess I'll close on the same point of legislation. I'm strong supporter, consistent supporter of net neutrality, as I understand it, and broadly speaking, internet consumer rights, including privacy, access to devices on the network, services on the network. I think we do need an updated law for net neutrality in the US, whether that's updating Title II, the Communications Act, and removing all the legacy restrictions on Ma Bell back when it was a monopoly environment, or adding a new title of the Communications Act, giving the FTC more authority, such as more specific rules, or a more general grant of rulemaking authority for net neutrality. Those are all options on the table, or if we're really getting creative, we could fold the FCC into the FTC and get it all in one place and have an internet tribunal of sorts, but who knows? So,
Awesome.
thank
you. Well, with the limited time left, I'm going to ask Ian if he has kind of a brief rebuttal or wants to address any particular point, and then I'm going to try and open up to a couple of questions, and we'll see where we go.
So the essential wedge between us is that I think it's time for specific lawmaking. The technology, in my view, is mature enough. We have a good enough view of the roadmap for where this is going on a technological level. And the threats are looming in terms of the ease with which carriers can use this technological capability to interfere. And history has shown, and I only gave you a couple of examples, but history has shown that they will. I have no delusions that if they thought they could get away with it, Verizon would deprioritize packet traffic from Ringcentral service to protect their business phone service. And if you think you don't have a dog in the fight in the US, remember that most of the services you access today in Canada are actually hosted in the United States, even if they're from Canadian companies. If you do a trace route from a command line of any computer, and you can find a specific server somewhere in Toronto or Halifax, odds are about 9 in 10 that the traffic between you and Toronto actually routes via Ohio and Chicago and Buffalo. So we don't really have an internet in Canada that is distinct from the United States. So what they're doing has a lot of effect on us. And again, carriers can often bias traffic for consumers versus their business customers, but generally they apply the same policies across the entire network because it's easier. In effect, I think we need to police our traffic, and again, I stand back on the idea of a Bill of Rights, which certainly benefits you as individual consumers, but would also benefit companies like Ringcentral or whatever is better than Ringcentral that is being developed somewhere in Canada.
Sean, do you have any particular thing you want to say?
Oh, yeah, I guess.
We're rebutting rebuttals now, so I wanted to be real quick.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to rebuttal to Ian's rebuttal, but I guess one thing I meant to mention in my talk, but Ian's idea about, I think the title of the presentation, about keeping the network down, which is traditionally how it's worked. It's all just sort of best efforts, internet traffic management, and sort of intelligence in the network. It's just packets in, packets out as fast as you can, hope it all works, and by and large it has. I think oftentimes I hear sort of that idea about dumb networks, smart ends, described as the end-to-end principle, which I think is a very similar concept to net neutrality from the application developer side. The whole benefit of the sort of end-to-end principle is that you can develop an application or a service at any point in the network, and you know that it'll work throughout the whole network because that's just how it works. The internet protocols are basic, and you just design your application around them and trust that it'll work. I think we could keep to the end-to-end principle and allow that freedom and certainty for app developers while still injecting more intelligence into the network through software-defined networking. In particular, maybe apply machine learning to software-defined networks in terms of traffic shaping. I think we could have a smart network that does engage in more differential traffic management while still respecting the end-to-end principle. But that's, I guess,
That's awesome. Great. So, are there any questions? I have some ideas of where we could go here, but are there any questions that anyone wants to ask of our combatants? All right. I'd like to do something with your permission if there are no questions. But I'm going to need Ian to log in. But I want to know if anybody objects. Have you both seen the Burger King net neutrality commercial?
No.
You have?
Yeah.
Are you okay if we show it to the group?
Sure.
Okay. And so this will be a little bit of a treat, and hopefully
I think I like these Wheatos.
they're really cool. I got it in grade, so I think your entire system is like persistent. So if you can
We're
just
not online, right?
we're not online.
Yeah. Well, we'll use some of my precious mobile bandwidth.
You sure you're okay with that?
Yeah.
Because I can get online.
Thousands of dollars I will now spend.
Well, with a fun, and by the way,
There we go.
the Netflix market cap is $141 billion. And
A long time ago, that guy wanted me to be his roommate. I wish I'd done it.
all right. And let's hope we have sound. We don't? Can you hear?
With net neutrality, some people, for what it's worth, just,
I don't know exactly what it is.
Got number one?
Hey,
How you doing?
you know what number 98 was followed?
Number 98, you got the Whopper?
Yeah.
So you got the slow access Whopper pass? It's on the menu right there, the fast, medium, slow. There's slow MBPS, fast MBPS, or hyper fast MBPS. MBPS, of course, standing for making burgers per second.
So if we want a Whopper now, we have to pay $26.
Well, that's how you get it fast. That's the highest priority. It's like a lane system. So it'll be like 15, yeah, fast lane, slow lane. So like you're there 15, 20 minutes.
What are you talking about?
Commercial ways that they can sell more and make more money.
Whopper. Were you given an option of chicken sandwich or?
Yeah, I don't want a chicken sandwich. I already want a Whopper.
Do you have any Whoppers ready that aren't?
Yeah.
The sandwich is ready, I'm just not allowed to actually get it to
Why?
you.
You can't give me the sandwich. It's ready, but you can't give it to me.
Whopper neutrality was repealed. They voted on it.
What?
Choice.
Oh, God, this is the worst thing I've ever heard of.
You got the fast.
Are you kidding me? You paid $26 for a Whopper?
You ordered it. Now it's a higher priority. So.
Guys, I have a little burger, man.
If you'd like,
This is a bad dream right now. I just want a burger, brother. A burger.
That's what I've already fixed.
here's what I'll do. You have the bag. Put it in the bag in 42 seconds.
Hold on. 10 seconds. You don't make the rules.
You just enforce these ridiculous rules.
We have to.
I feel like I was being taken advantage of in a sense. Just as a customer coming in to get their food is felt like a power move.
They already changed the policies overnight or whatever.
I didn't think that ordering a Whopper would really open my eyes up to net neutrality. The Whopper actually told me about net neutrality. It's stupid, but true.
Right, enjoyed that.
Yeah, there's the Reese's cup.
So hopefully that was a good use of your bandwidth.
Yeah.
So, does that prompt any questions? Otherwise, I'll ask some. Please.
So, I guess some people would argue that the very slow Whopper would actually be like $1.99 or something like that, especially the fast one's $25.99. It wouldn't just be like the same Whopper price, and then for the fast one you pay like $26.
Sure. I mean, yeah, that's the whole like interconnection pricing. I mean, it's depending on how you structure your pricing, it could be good for consumers. You know, if it ranged from $1 to $5, maybe that would be a reasonable pro-consumer system privatization for Whopper. But obviously, that was made to sort of illustrate the point that it could also be used very harmfully in a way that consumers would hate.
So I'll just maybe play off that question, but and really off the video. How do you feel